Okay, so I'm live today, episode 8 of 52 weeks of AWS. And in particular, I'm going to cover infrastructure as code, which is a pretty cool topic because I think many people are getting used to this concept of building out the infrastructure alongside the code in your project and also tapping that into your build system as well and making the whole process automatic. I think there's still a lot of confusion around it and there are many options as well. And so that's something I thought I would talk about today a little bit is, what is infrastructure as code? Why is it important? What are some of the options to do it? And then I'll go through and walk through a Python CDK example where I use infrastructure as code to deploy a Lambda function inside of AWS. And then I'll also go in and invoke that same Lambda function, both from the console and then also from the AWS Cloud9 environment. So really, if you're interested in the whole concept of infrastructure as code and also Amazon CDK, this is a good live stream / podcast to pay attention to. So to start with, I think I'll just walk through a overview of what it is. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And I'm going to bring up in Sketchpad, an overview of what it is that infrastructure as code is. And I'll go through here and bring up my tablet here just to do a quick overview of what infrastructure as code really is. So here's a good example of what infrastructure as code is. If we go into this concept, it's really thinking about the cloud as a virtual network. And so in this case, if we see that there's a infinite ability to do networking, to do CPU, to do disk IO, you have the ability to also program it to do anything you want. And that's really the core concept of why infrastructure as code is a big deal. So what that means is inside of your source control repository where you would build out a microservice, for example, in GitHub, you can go through here and you build out a microservice. Alongside that, you would also build out your infrastructure as code. And this would live inside of here. This could be, for example, Amazon's Cloud Development Kit or Google's Cloud Development Kit or Azure's Cloud Development Kit, whatever cloud you're on. And then every time you push a change into the build system, that build system would not only do the things that most projects would do, which would be install your code, go through and test your code, but it would also go through and deploy your code. And the way it would deploy the code would be unique in that it would use this infrastructure as code to create something called idempotent action. So idempotent is a little bit difficult to spell on the fly, but I think I got it. The idea here with idempotent is that every time you make a change, the same thing happens. It can verify the status of where you're at in your project. So your cluster of machines or your networking or whatever you're trying to do, it'll always maintain that state. So infrastructure as code is something that all projects should include, and it would be part of the process of installation, testing, and deployment. And I'm going to walk you through exactly how to do this using the AWS platform. So to start off with, the first thing I'm going to do is show you an overview of what this would look like. So if we go through here, and by the way, if you want to look at a pre-trained version of this where you can look at the whole thing, you can click on either of these two links to watch a walkthrough. But in a nutshell, this workshop here is a pretty good workshop that talks about everything you would do with Lambda and deploy it. You could take a handler right here and push it into production as long as you follow this structure. And this structure here shows us how to create our first CDK project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift gears here and I'm going to go over to the console in AWS, which is right here. And this is the AWS Cloud9 environment. What's so awesome about the AWS Cloud9 environment is that it allows me to build up a temporary development environment that I can actually go through and write my code in, and then it'll keep the project inside of there. And I also have access to all the AWS tools. So let's go ahead and open up one of these environments here, and we'll just call this CDK, Python Lambda, and then I can put in here, this is a IAC demo. We'll go to next step. And from here, I would just leave everything default if you've never used the Amazon Cloud9 environment, because I want a slightly more powerful machine for the demo to be a little quicker. I'll pick this M5 large and then go to the next step here and create an environment. It usually goes live in, let's say, 30 seconds to a minute or so. So behind the scenes, what's happening is it's launching a virtual machine in the AWS environment, and it's tapping inside of it and putting this whole development environment inside of the virtual machine. So what's really awesome about it is that everything you would need to do to develop on the AWS platform is pretty much done for you. And so you don't have to worry about, building out anything tricky, because it's all, for the most part, it's been done for you. So let's give this thing just a second here to open up. And let's, there we go. All right, so the first thing that I'm going to do when I open the things up here is just give you a brief overview of what's happening in this environment. You can see that if I click on the left side of the AWS Cloud9 environment, I can go through here and actually see all these AWS tools to play around with, and in particular Lambda. If I want to go through here and do some kind of invocation, I can invoke a Lambda, which is something we'll do in a second. But it's really a nice integration here for you to develop your code. We're going to start, though, with the first thing here, which is getting the CDK environment installed. And notice if we go to prerequisites in this example, that it's going to ask us to follow all the prerequisites in the AWS CDK user guide. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up. If I look at the official documentation, we scroll down here, that the main thing we want to make sure of is we have to install the AWS CDK environment. And to do that, we're going to have to do this command here, which is npm install -g AWS-CDK. So let's go ahead and copy that. I'm going to go back into my environment, and all I have to do is paste that in. I'll make this a little bit bigger so we have a bigger window, and then I'll go ahead and paste this in. npm install -g AWS-CDK. Now, it's going to tell us a couple things here, and it's important when we're doing the CDK process to really pay attention to the standard out, because the standard out will give us lots of things that we can actually pay attention to. So let's go ahead and do this. We'll do npm install -g, the latest version of npm, and I'll actually need to do the force option here if it doesn't go through, but it looks like it did. And then if I go through here and I check what version I'm running, this will tell me whether I was able to update it or not. So I'm going to type in CDK version, and it looks like we are running 2.3. So what we'll need to do is run this command again here, npm install, but I'll need to do --force so that it will upgrade the version. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. Perfect. And now if I go and I do the CDK version, you'll see that it's 2.8. So that's really a big takeaway here, is that if you do want to get the latest version, you may have to do the --force, because the Cloud9 environment may not have the latest version of it installed. Really, that's the only prerequisite step here. And then if I go back to this example project here, I can go into the Python workshop section, and I can just follow the project initialization. So I'm going to really just copy exactly what they tell me to do. I'm going to copy this CDK workshop directory and CD into it. So I'll go ahead and do that right here. And then the next thing that they want us to do here is initialize a project structure. Let's go ahead and copy this. We'll go through here and we'll copy this. And so this will just lay out this whole structure for us. And again, we would want to pay attention to all the things that are happening, and notice that it created a virtual environment for us, which is a place for us to use the code. I'm going to have to go through here and source it. Now that it's sourced, I can do a pip install, which is this command. And if we look inside of this workshop directory here, you can see this requirements.txt file. It has the packages that are important. which is the AWS CDK lib and the constructs package. So all I need to do is just do a pip install because we're inside a virtual environment, which installs all the library code into a particular directory. This will take just a second here for us to get this thing cooking. Once this is done, then the next step is to go through and just verify that everything works. And the way I would do that would be to we can synthesize the CloudFormation template for this code. So we can type in CDK synth. Let's go ahead and do that. And this should, I could just type it in. It's easier. CDK synth. And we see that it's now working inside of our environment. So we're pretty close now to being able to build out a structure for infrastructure to deploy something. All I need to do is scroll down to one of these sections. And if you wanted to do this on your own, you could go through any of these examples, but I'm going to just pick the Hello World Lambda. I'm a huge fan of writing Lambda functions because they're a piece of code that you can run in response to an event. That's really what an AWS Lambda is. And all I need to do is create a directory and then create a Hello World file inside of this directory. So pretty simple here. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to make a directory called Lambda, and then I'm going to touch a file inside of this Lambda directory called hello.py. And we really could put pretty much anything we want inside of this environment. In fact, why don't I just make things a little bit fun here and write my own from scratch here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up in this IDE. And this is really where it comes in handy to have the IDE available for us. Is I know a little bit about writing lambdas here. So I'm all I really care about is the handler name is the most important part. And the way the handler works is that it'll accept an event in the context. The event is the payload that you're going to receive from some kind of trigger, like, for example, a web service. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write something I do a lot with Lambda is a Marco Polo function. So we'll say if the events has a name associated with it called Marco, what I can do is I can return back the word Polo, right? So pretty straightforward concept. And then I can do another return statement where if it doesn't match that name, I can just return back no. And what's nice about this is it's only 4 lines of code, and it's going to be pretty simple for us to test up. And now we're pretty close. All I need to do is go over to the down section here, and I'm going to need to build out the stack information. So the stack will tell Lambda, all all these things for us to pay attention to. And I can just copy this to the clipboard, go back to this information and find the workshop information in here. And this is the stack. And so this has some stuff already built in here for us. We can just get rid of it. We don't need any of that. And I can just paste in the new information. And what's nice about this is that, so let's see, unexpected indent. We may need to clean this up a little bit. Let's just double check that. Got that cleaned up. Okay, good. So the key idea here is that you import these libraries from CDK, and then you build out the structure to deploy your code into production. And then from here, we would just essentially call this thing something. In this case, we'll call it hello handler. We'll call this hello handler Marco, and then we're very close to being able to deploy. What I can do is I can scroll down here and I can type in the word CDK diff. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's type in go here and we'll type in CDK diff. And what this does is it shows us what would be in production versus what's actually on my machine and what the changes will be. And here we go. It says that It's going to make these changes to the policy, which would be the ability to invoke certain resources in AWS. And it's going to go through and also change a Lambda function itself and make one called hello handler Marco. So great. This all looks good to me. Now we can do a one-liner. So this is where the build system in the future with GitHub Actions or AWS Code Build or Jenkins or whatever it is you want to do comes in handy. You just type in CDK deploy. So that's your build step. CDK deploy, build and deploy. Let's go ahead and deploy this thing into production. Pretty cool process, really, when you think about it, because I can actually control everything inside of the AWS toolkit. I don't have to use some third-party vendor that's IPOing that wants to create revenue and get me hooked into their ecosystem. I can just build this directly on the AWS environment. And so in this environment here, you can see that I'm updating the formation stack, and we'll get these little updates here behind the scenes. Now I can toggle very briefly here to the AWS console. If we look inside of the AWS console here, we should be able to see CloudFormation and look at what it's doing. So if you go through here, you can go to CloudFormation and see how the CDK environment controls CloudFormation, which in turn controls the infrastructure of AWS. And we see right here, it's doing an update, right? It's doing an update of something in CDK. Also, I could go to the Lambda environment. And if we go to Lambda, this is where I would find that Lambda function and play around with it. Now, what I like to do is I like to actually toggle last modified, and we will see that the last modified will show us what's happening. So if we go here, I can just sit here and wait for it. It should take just a second or so. Once this is done, I can then go into AWS Lambda console and then invoke it. Then the final thing I'll do is I'll go inside of AWS Cloud9 and I'll also invoke it. So really there's a couple different ways you can test out your code when you're developing it. But what is really nice about this is that I could then check this into GitHub and have a full end-to-end microservice that not only had testing, linting, and formatting, but also had the deploy process. And the deploy process is as simple as there's a Python script right here that is just a few lines of code, and it defines out the infrastructure for my project and deploys it using CloudFormation. And also we have the powerful tools that allow us to do things like diff whatever changes I made. And that really is pretty cool, because if you can imagine building a really complicated, infrastructure as code project, really complicated serverless project where there's lots of changes between, different resources, you can do a diff to make sure that you didn't accidentally screw something up. And it really is important. Here we see the final step, which is, it says create in progress. And it, I believe, is now cleaning up things. It's deleting some other things in the past, which was, I had an old handler there before, which is pretty cool. It like swaps out this handler for that handler. And then all I have to do is now go up and take a look. You can see it took a little bit longer than it normally takes because it was cleaning up some resources from another invocation. But now I'm ready to go. So I just go here and I do a refresh, and we see, look, 41 seconds ago, this was deployed. Let's go ahead and click this button, and we can see that a very straightforward Lambda function is in front of us, right? So I was able to deploy this programmatically. Very simple to test. I'm going to configure a test event. The way test events work is you build out a JSON payload and you send that payload into your Lambda function. And that's what the event is. So I'm going to say Marco here. I'll go through here and I'll say name. And this one will be Marco. And if I go through here, I format it and say create, I can just test this out. And look, we see the response is Polo. If I make another event here and I go create a new event, I can go ahead and say Bob, and we'll go through here and we'll say Bob. What happens when we send this one out is it'll say, let's go and test Bob, test this out. There we go. No, right. So you can see that basically it switches which return statement based on whether the word is Marco or if it's anything else. So really, really straightforward and easy Lambda function, but I think it shows the power of infrastructure as code. And again, I could just put this in as part of GitHub Actions. Now, there's yet another way that you can deploy infrastructure as code using the CDK system, Invoke it, which is using the AWS hook here inside of AWS Cloud9. If I go to Lambda, I can just find that Marco Polo function here, which I believe, if maybe I need to refresh this real quick, and then I'll check it out again, just so it's got the latest information. And if I go to Lambda inside of AWS Cloud9, we should see that there is a Marco Polo, which should be called CDK Workshop, Hello Handler Marco Polo. There we go. If I right click on this, I can click Invoke on AWS, and it will give me a interface. It's a little bit like if you've ever used Visual Studio, where it gives you controls on things. I could take other payloads, or I could just type my own payload in here, and we go through here and we just say this. We just say, name, then do Marco, and I could send this payload in. Scroll down a little bit here, send this payload in, and then there we go. We got a result. And in fact, if I go back to this environment here, I can go to the logs, which should show up under monitor. And if we go to logs, you can see actually all the logs of it being invoked. And so I could even go into CloudWatch and just verify that, in fact, my Cloud9 environment was the thing that was invoking it. And it's pretty easy to do because I could just add in some additional logging information. So that's probably a good place to stop for what I was covering here. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So just to kind of wrap things up here a little bit, the idea here with infrastructure as code is that it simplifies your project. It makes it easier in the future to maintain your project. I was talking to some students about this yesterday, that it's the concept of either an asset or debt. So if you have $100,000 in debt and you pay 13% interest, that's not great, right? Because you're constantly having to pay for the interest, and you're constantly having a liability. On the flip side, if you have an asset, like let's say something in an index fund, and it's earning interest every year, or some kind of appreciation, 7 to 10%, then you're actually benefiting from the growth of that asset. The same goes with code. You either have something like infrastructure as code, which can provision things and maintain things for you, so it's an asset, or you have a liability, which is you don't have infrastructure as code, and then constantly you're in technical debt and you're getting yourself into trouble. So that's the way I would think about infrastructure as code. If you don't have some kind of infrastructure as code that deploys automatically with a build system, you're in deep trouble as your organization, and you should immediately invest in it. If you do, it could be something where you do a little bit of work initially up front. It takes slightly longer to set it up, but then for the rest of the life of your project, you know that you have high quality code, and that you can actually count on that infrastructure for the duration of your project, and then do things like CDK diff. So that's probably what I wanted to cover for today. I think next week I'll probably dive a little bit into the solutions architect material again, maybe shift gears a little bit, go through that material for a few weeks, and then go into some coding again after that. On Monday, I do have a special episode, which is I'm talking with the authors of the AWS cookbook, the O'Reilly book, and we're going to talk about some of the stuff in their book, and they're going to share some of their insights. So that'll be pretty cool too. So there'll be a couple episodes next week, and that the Monday one will be at 5:30 p.m. Eastern time. So see everybody next week, and enjoyed talking to you today about CDK.